In the Bleak Deepwinter by Lynn Abbey, published Dragon Magazine number 242, published December 1997, read by A.J. Pickett. The air soured at midday. By early dusk, the blizzard had begun in earnest, hurling frigid claws against the walls of Cato's charter house. The stout timbers held the worst at bay, but wisps of ice sparkled above all the candles. Save for the blizzard's howl, Cato's was a quiet place. None of the locals who came each evening to gossip was foolish enough to leave home on such a night, and the woodsfolk who dribbled in during the bleak afternoon were a taciturn lot, given to staring at the hearth and nursing a single flagon until midnight. Burr, the dwarf who worked for Cato, had little to do. He'd spent the afternoon in the tiny room he called home, checking out the gear he'd been wearing that night, some 2 decades past, when he'd stumbled through another blizzard and across the Charterhouse's threshold for the first time. Blizzards were rare enough here on the borderland between the lonely moor and the forgotten forest. 2 winters, even 3, might pass without a ferocious storm, but the blizzards would come, and when their winds were strongest, Burr would gird himself with the fine weapons and armour he kept in his room and hurl himself straight at the storm's fist. It wasn't something Burr wanted to do. It was something that he had to do since the first storm, when he hadn't known what waited in the snow. Years ago, he'd tried getting stone drunk, but he'd gone out anyway, surviving only because Cato had followed him. Since then, Burr took better care of himself when the air soured, lest Cato follow him again. Cato was a good man with a wife, 3 children, and a crippled mother-in-law, all depending on him. Cato had no need of the snow cave. Burr's need grew stronger with every howling wind. It burned behind his eyes. "You stay here," he'd told Cato, slamming a polished flagon on a shelf. His hands had begun to shake. He made a fist and shook it in the human's face. "I've got to. You don't. You understand that? You stay here, no matter what. You don't come looking for me. Not tonight, not next week, not next month or next spring. If I don't come back, you let me rot out there. You understand?" Cato pulled away with the wooden expression of a honest man trapped into lying. "I understand." They stared at each other, years of friendship and a score of blizzard nights between them. "Swear it by your—" Burr began as the door sighed on its hinges. A blast of frigid wind shook every flame in the room, extinguishing half the candles and 2 of the lamps. In the light that remained, Burr and Cato took the newcomer's measure. He was above middling height and wrapped in shaggy fur. The leather-wrapped hilt of a great sword stuck up above his right shoulder, and the shifting sound of chain mail accented his slightest move. His hands were sheathed in bare paw gauntlets. His leggings might have come from the same source. A shroud of ice-rimmed wool shielded his face. There was a slit for his eyes, but the shadows and cold were such that not even Burr's dwarven vision could guess their temper. They watched as the newcomer strode to the dry rack where the woodsfolk had left their cloaks. Precious metal glinted as he opened the cloak clasp. His hood fell back, dumping ice on the taproom floor and releasing an unexpected wealth of silver hair. Cato shot another silent question Burr's way, and the dwarf answered with a puzzled shrug. Anything was possible here, where the ruins of Decanter were only 2 days' journey to the northeast. The newcomer might be an elf or a half-elf or a man years past his prime. Burr was prepared for anything, he thought, as the man unwound his woolen shroud. Anything but a woman. "Dear lady," Cato began, ever the courteous innkeeper, "may I help?" She nailed Cato with a scowl, and suddenly the taproom was colder than the night outside. "Brandy. Warmed. Now." Without the scowl, she might have been beautiful. Burr reckoned he had visited 100 cities before he wound up in the borderland, and he had never seen a demeanour quite as harsh. He nodded as Cato closed his hand around a thumbnail-sized divination crystal. Holding the crystal between his eye and the glass-bottomed flagon, Cato scryed the woman's aura. Burr asked a silent question, and Cato shrugged. "Plain as you or me," Cato whispered. Retrieving a wax-covered bottle, he filled the flagon with amber brandy. The dwarf wasn't reassured, though. He did his best to reassure the inn's other patrons as he carried the flagon across the room. As the woodfolk went back to nursing their drinks, Burr boosted himself onto a stool beside the silver-haired scowl. "Burr," he introduced himself, offering his hand after he had set the flagon down. His fingers might have been serpents in her glare. He shoved his hand beneath the table and tried again. "Will you be needing a bed down, dear lady? There's room upstairs, but with the storm, folk are sleeping down here where it's warm." The woman held the flagon over the table lamp. Her fingers were blue-white from cold and unflinching in the flame. Silence lasted until Burr's fingers ached from imagined burns. "No," was her answer. "Got a horse for the stable?" "No." "Got a name?" She raised her head. Burr wished he were somewhere else. "Wrecker," she said, and drained the flagon in 2 long swallows. Hardly a declaration of friendship, but enough for Burr to pursue the conversation. "I know what you've come for. I came for it too. 21 winters ago. I didn't know enough then, but I do now. I know how to find it, how to fight what guards it, how to cross the last threshold. It's taken me 21 years, but I'm ready, Wrecker, and I'll be your guide, right to the end. If you want the scrolls, that's no matter to me. Same with the jewels and gold, but there's a box. A plain wooden box with no lock. I'll take that, and that alone, for my share." The white pressure in his skull that was his need to be out in the storm brought tears to Burr's eyes. It would be easier if she'd hire him, but it wouldn't make any difference. The ghost was inside him, as it had been inside him since the first blizzard night. He'd do what he had to do, what the ghosts wanted him to do. Remove that box from Felsel's cave. "I don't share," Wrecker said in a tone that warned against further inquiries. She pushed the empty flagon across the table. "Another." Burr did her bidding like any tavern scut. "Ask me anything," he said when he returned. "Anything at all. Felsel's ghost, I beat it 10 times, but it comes back with the cave. The ice pit, I know how to get across. The cold fury, the dark mist, I knew the names when I came here. But it's all or nothing, dear lady, the precious little time before the cave sinks back into the storm. Take my advice. Make me your guide, or you'll be sitting here when the next storm blows." Wrecker held the fresh flagon above the lamp, felt flame lick her fingers. There was no pain. She was a century past physical pain. She had seen the human innkeeper peering through the glass-bottomed flagon and countered his crystal charm with a thought. She'd needed her magic to defeat the snow cave's guardians, Felsel's ghost, the fury, and the rest. The dwarf had his facts straight, but Wrecker hadn't meant for anyone to see through her warrior's trappings just yet. The dwarf might have been lucky. Strangers couldn't be common here, especially not during a blizzard. With or without her magic blazing, she wasn't inconspicuous. Sometimes Wrecker did share the loot she harvested from out-of-time, out-of-place bolt holes like Felsel's snow cave, but not with anyone who reeked of wrong the way Burr did. He'd been ghost-bit, perhaps, in one of Felsel's traps, or maybe he was just crazed. Any man might lose his mind up here where the air still stank of Netherill's sorcery, 2 millennia after that dark empire's collapse. "I don't share. Do yourself a favor. Leave me alone, and, above all else, don't follow me." It was the longest speech she'd made in a month, and she took a sip of brandy to soothe her throat afterward. He stayed in the chair, leaning the way plain folk did when they wanted something so much that it fairly burst their skulls. Rekka lowered the flagon, spun a brass ring on the second finger of her left hand. She could break him with the spells hammered into that ring. But he scraped the chair back from the table before she needed to use it. The innkeeper, the dwarf, and other strangers around her watched with sidelong glasses and ill-disguised luck signs, but they kept their distance as Rekka nursed her second flagon through the long evening. Around midnight, the innkeeper banked the fire, the lodgers bedding down in snoring heaps near the hearth. Burr extinguished all the lamps and candles save one, which was enough for Rekka to watch him leave the tap room and come back a little later with weapons and armour glinting beneath a cloak. Yet he said nothing and stayed put when she clasped her own cloak, which was still sitting at a table, a shadow among shadows, when she put her hand on the door and left the Charterhouse without a sound or draught to mark her passage. Burr had begun his search for Felsel's cave 21 winters ago. Then he was a beginner in the quest's game. Rekka had first heard the Netherese wizard's name whispered in Yenogu's realm more than a century ago. She hadn't been looking for Felsel then. She scarcely remembered what she had been looking for, except it must have been magic, and she must have found it. Not that she needed more magic then or now. All the magic Rekka needed was locked in her mind, hammered into the ring she wore or etched into the flexible steel plates lining her belt and baldric. She was prepared for ghosts, even Felsel's ghost, and she hadn't tripped a trap by accident since the day she blundered through the time weave and found herself unharmed and unaged on the other side. It was a mixed blessing to know she couldn't age and might not ever die. Rekka hadn't known her family. She'd sworn off friendships because, even without questions or jealousy, there was still the pain of watching death steal them away. The search for magic was her life. The artifacts and grimoires she kept in a cave beneath the sea of swords were simply the means to tally score in a solitary game. Perhaps she could have hired Burr, not because she needed a guide, but dwarves were a long-lived race and more sociable than 10 elves together. A blast of icy wind unfurled the hem of Rekka's cloak. She put a stop to her melancholy with an earnest curse and a frantic retying of the cloak's inside laces. At every step she took the storm's measure and, keeping firm hands on her cloak's hood and hem, strode into its worst. A thick frozen glaze atop her shaggy cloak had made the task easier by the time she confronted the first warding. A single word she'd learned of the plains of fire banished the black ice mist. With one stride, Rekka entered a place colder than the blizzard, yet eerily still and utterly dark. She'd been warned that the cave would stifle any sound before it left her mouth. From here on, her spells were primed by thoughts or gesture. She made hand fire with a gesture and a bit of yellow crystal, then set it afloat overhead, where its light could play no tricks with her vision. Yet light alone wouldn't help against Felsel's ice pit, a bottomless crevasse that circled the innermost chamber and was sealed with a whisper-thin sheet of ice. One of the tomes she'd consulted in preparation for this journey advised the quester to carry a sack of not less than 200 fist-sized stones, and for an extra margin of safety, to sole his boots with iron rasps. Wise precautions, perhaps. Heavy precautions, certainly, and time-consuming in a place where time was of the essence. Unless it was written on a scroll she hadn't found, Rekka knew of no spell that would let her remain in the snow cave once the blizzard's fury began to abate. It would simply melt away and return intact, as Burr had noted, with the next fierce storm. Rekka preferred simpler tactics. With the ring's twist she rose a handspan above the thick ice or not thick ice, whichever the case may be. Felsel had conjured guardians as well as traps for his bolt hole, sentient winds, hoarfrost beasts, a serpent formed from ice so hard it held a honed seal edge. Rekka faced them all without surprise or ill effect, dispatching the serpent with her great sword because, in her private reckoning, Triumph by might was worth more than triumph by magic. But might took longer than magic, and she was relieved when Felsil's final obstacle shimmered in front of her. It was, as predicted, a freezing ghost, possibly the wizard himself, or his doppelganger. Bright, diaphanous frost veils unfurled around the ghost, seeking to draw Rekka into a fatal embrace. She floated backward, staying just out of reach as she shaped her thoughts into the mnemonic trigger of a common frost spell. Another bit of Yenogu gossip. Felsil's cave, like so many well-defended and wizardly places, was vulnerable to a simple yet precise attack. A toothy grin spread across Rekka's face as the veils ceased their hungry shimmering. But the danger wasn't gone. The ghost was merely stunned. It would recover if she let it, which she wouldn't. Rekka dug deep into the hem of her sleeve, withdrawing a handful of red, white, and black powder, which she blew at the immobilized ghost. More incendiary than sorceress, the flakes had been dried from the hottest peppers known to mortals and immortals alike. Rekka shook with silent laughter as the stricken ghost sneezed itself into oblivion. A chamber filled with treasure worthy of a dragon opened in front of Rekka. She paused before entering it. Burr had mentioned a final threshold that he alone knew how to cross. No one else spoke of a trap after the ghost, but a warning was a warning, and she was glad to have had one a moment later when the faintest breeze riffled her hair. She spun rightward, whipping the great sword through a shallow cut. The blade bit into something she never saw, and a scream echoed in her mind without having touched her ears. "I owe you one," she said to the absent dwarf. Hearing her own voice, Rekka judged she had passed all the trials and dangers. The wooden box without a lock, she decided, would be the proper debt gift, if there were time to look for it. Searching the bolt hole would be no small challenge. Felsil wasn't much of a housekeeper. Well, neither was Rekka. She attacked the clutter with the same reckless vigour she used in her own bolt hole, hurling objects left and right, but not without examining them. Rekka knew the blizzard had begun to wane when the bolt hole sighed, and the hand fire above her head took on a greenish hue. The chamber appeared little different than it had when she had entered, save for a heap of tomes and scrolls near the centre. She still had a quarter of the floor and a whole wall left to glean. Curiosity, or, to give it its true name, greed, had gotten the better of Rekka early on in her magic questing days, but she was wiser now and willing to settle for a smaller haul safely stashed in her own bolt hole. There would be other winters, other storms. Rekka took a thin leather sheet from her belt and shook it into a large sack, big enough to hold her swag. She was half packed when she heard a noise at her back, where no noise could be ignored. Clenching her fist and shaking her forearm in a single gesture, Rekka dropped a feathered dart into her palm. It was out of her hand and flying towards its target before her mind understood what her eyes saw. By itself, the dart was a puny weapon, but the drops of venom wax behind its needle tip could kill in a heartbeat. The Charterhouse dwarf was dead before he knew he was hurt. "Your fault," Rekka said harshly, fighting the rage that guilt invariably roused within her. "Not mine." He'd come for the wooden box without a lock. It fell from his spasmed fingers as he collapsed on the increasingly transparent floor of Felsil's bolt hole. Rekka stared at it a moment, then scooped it into the sack along with the scrolls and other artifacts. She had the sack drawn shut and half knotted when she noted mist rising from the corpse. The wrongness she observed in the Charterhouse had a name now, and that name was Gaius. Another time, another place, and the spell might have captured her curiosity. And this time, this place, Rekka deflected it with a quick wave of her hand. It dissipated without a fight. That told her something about the spell the dwarf had fouled. The mage who'd cast it wasn't her peer. As a result, she doubted the Gaius had come from Felsil. That mage's reputation, though dark, had been honestly earned. More likely someone else in the millennia since Netherall's demise had heard the tales of Felsel's snow cave and ensorcelled some misfortunate into braving its dangers. Rekka's curiosity ebbed as the Gaius ebbed and vanished with the snow cave. Rekka was returned to the blizzard, which had not, to her human senses, abated much. She reached into the storm, spoke a spell-laced word, and withdrew her travelling companion, a gnarled staff faintly glowing in the wind-driven snow. The staff held the location of every forlorn, forsaken place Rekka had ever visited, and, more importantly, offered swift passage to her bolt hole beneath the sea of swords. A few thoughts were all she needed, memories of rock and salt, thick fur carpets, and a pot of tea steeped beside her favourite chair. A lightning bolt struck the staff as it awakened. Unusual, but not unprecedented, and no great cause for concern, considering the sack she carried and the cave she'd left. Still, Rekka took precautions as her bolt hole formed around her. Hand fire revealed nothing untoward, except at the corner of awareness, a flickering mist. Geese weren't sentient in any ordinary sense, but some could flit from life to life until their purpose was accomplished. Rekka could have cast such a persistent spell, but it seemed odd that a mage whose geas would be deflected once again with a simple gesture could also have cast one strong enough to follow Rekka's staff between the snow cave and her own well-warded bolt hole. Still, the geas had vanished again, and compared to what Rekka expected to glean from Felsel's hoard, it was a minor interest. She plucked out the topmost tome and settled in her chair. A deep purple flame bloomed at the tip of one finger. She touched the cracked enamel of an otherwise unremarkable teapot, and steam rose instantly from its spout, and the scent of sambar herbs filled the cave. Rekka lost herself in thaumaturgical theories, which had been old when Netherall vanished beneath the Anarok sands. An hour passed, an afternoon, an evening, a day. Fascinating, she murmured, closing the book. All from a tincture of arnica and willow bark. Her mind raced towards applications, variations, and the cat-sized mist above the teapot. Flicking her wrist, she snarled, "Begone!" And, like a cat, the Gaius leapt for her shoulder, curling around her neck, caressing her ear. Rekka could almost hear its frustrated sigh. No Gaius, no matter how persistent, could wriggle uninvited into her warded thoughts. The Gaius sank to the floor and seemed the essence of misery and despair. Rekka could have, and probably should have, sundered it utterly, but that seemed unnecessary. Besides, Rekka was hungry. A cook fire was unthinkable in the cave. Rekka plucked a handful of bright-coloured pebbles from a bowl beside her chair and conjured morsels of cold spice meat. Chewing one and trying to decide if she had conjured red meat or white or some impossibly in-between mixture, Rekka plucked Felsel's wooden box from her sack. A box with no lock, the dwarf had said truthfully, but Felsel's box didn't fall open in her lap. By its weight, she guessed it was hollow. By the many woods worked into it, she guessed it was a puzzle. Some 20 pieces sat on the carpet beside her before Rekka conceded that the box was empty. She'd played a few unfair tricks with spells and artifacts over the years, but she judged Felsel an unnecessarily cruel mage. At least, she would never have crafted a Gaius that compelled unwitting men to their deaths in pursuit of empty boxes. Rekka dumped the wooden chips in the bowl with the bright pebbles. Movement against the carpet caught Rekka's eye. She thought immediately of the persistent Gaius and readied a spell to destroy it for good. The invoking words were on the tip of her tongue, the gesture at her fingertips, but the movement hadn't come from the Gaius. Felsel's box hadn't been empty. In slack-jawed astonishment, Rekka watched a man in the prime of his life materialize on her carpet. If he'd meant her harm, he'd have been the first human in 100 years with a fighting chance against her, but he lay as one asleep. Rekka took a moment to rally her defences, and another to marvel at his clothes, which were like none she'd ever seen, considering the breadth of her travels. That was an accomplishment. "Netheril?" Rika muttered. She'd seen images of Felsil and his peers, all of them created since Netheril's collapse, and none of them accurate. None of them depicting a diamond-quilted tunic, wrapped breeches, or the square-toed boots so evident on her floor. The stranger's eyelids fluttered. Rika paid closer attention to his face. It was a pleasant face, the sort of face Rika had seen on countless ordinary folk, whose thoughts and dreams lay beyond her comprehension. A Tanari lord rising from the abyss could not have disturbed her more. Tanari lord would, at least, make no demands on her cave's precious air. Already, the mote of her consciousness that kept the air breathable felt the strain of an extra pair of lungs. She had to get the stranger to one of her surface retreats, none of which she'd visited within the past year. Her best choice was deep in the aptly named Winterwood, where an outcast druid worked off a debt caretaking a hunter's lodge on her behalf. Her staff took the lodge from her memory. It awakened with a shudder, and so did the stranger. His eyes were honey-coloured when they opened, and terror-stricken a heartbeat later, he began babbling in an unfamiliar language. Netherese. Possibilities exploded in Rika's imagination. Spoken words triggered many spells, ancient and modern. The vocalizing triggers of the Netherese magic had been long lost along with their language, until this moment. Rika considered what she'd gain if she forced rapport and swallowed his language whole. Instead of her staff, she reached for a crystal-tipped wand, especially ensorcelled for rapport with another living mind. When the man saw it in her hand, he fell pale and silent. She imagined herself in his place, awakened from a millennial sleep, brought on perhaps by a similar wand. "Calm yourself," Rika advised as she knelt beside him. He didn't understand, of course, but he was too weak from his imprisonment or terror to resist when she traced the patterns of a language across his face. Silent, he closed his eyes and fists so tightly that they trembled, but not from fear. "Brave man," Rika said before grasping his wrists and drawing him to his knees. "It will be over quickly, I promise." A nimbus bloomed around his skull. Rika stopped breathing and brought her forehead to rest against his. The choice was hers. Breathe in, and the language of Netheril was hers, but the stranger would be left mute. Breathe out, and the common tongue of Faerun would permeate his thoughts, possibly erasing any other language he knew. Breathe in, or breathe out? Rika breathed out. The man chilled in his grasp. His body temperature plummeting, she held him fast, kept him alive until her mind was as empty as her lungs. He was unconscious, and she was exhausted, but it was the exhaustion of success, not failure, and she reached for her staff. It was a steel-grey noontime, with fresh snow on the ground when the staff brought them to the Winterwood lodge. The druid was nowhere to be found, and judging by the debris on the floor and the holes in the roof, he hadn't left recently. Rika spared the time to send a superating curse after the druid before attacking the chaos. If housework had been a magical art, Rika would have become its master, but it wasn't, and neither was she. Her hearth fire vented more smoke through the holes in the roof than through the chimney, and the stranger, on whose behalf she wrestled blankets and straw into a bed, resisted when she settled him in it. "I suppose you could do better?" she demanded, shaking her last dusty blanket over him. He didn't need to answer. She'd studied his hands as she moved him. They were the scarred and calloused hands of a man who'd worked hard. Though he was too well-fed and well-dressed to be a peasant, he wasn't a wizard either, and he was too old to be anyone's apprentice. He roused Rika's curiosity as no magic had in decades. She wanted to talk to him about Netheril and the days of sorcery run wild. She certainly didn't want anyone to harm him while she was hunting meat for the pot balanced oh so delicately on the hearth irons. So she circled his bed with salt and camphor, raising wards that flickered as he breathed. The Winterwood remembered Rika. It gave her nothing she didn't earn. for that was the way of wild places. Yet she found tracks she wouldn't have seen if the forest were against her. 2 fat rabbits hung over her shoulder when the dreary afternoon gave way to wind-whipped twilight as she returned to the lodge. Fire still glowed in the hearth. That was the lesser of the 2 astonishments greeting her. The greater astonishment, harder to see than the fire, was a translucent spirit hovering near the stranger's wards. The spirit had the shape of a young human woman, dressed in garments not entirely unlike those the strange man wore, albeit of better quality. Rekka took note of ghostly gold pins in thick dark hair. A sorceress of Netheril? Felsil's rival? Rekka raised her right hand, her finger curled, brushing the ring at the base of her thumb, invoking a spell that could sunder any spirit from its essence. But she left the spell uncast. The spirit seemed aware of nothing except the unconscious man, not even of the powerful wards that cast up a myriad of blue-green sparks when the spirit unwisely challenged them. It shrank back, and to the extent that a spirit could wreak emotion, Rekka felt its pain and desperate disappointment. Those sensations, so similar to the reflected misery and despair Rekka had felt when the persistent gas had failed to penetrate her mind's warded thoughts, solved its mystery as well. The maid who'd crafted the gas had fueled it with her own spirit. The gas persisted because she persisted, because the man imprisoned in an empty box had meant more to her than life? By the laws of magic Rekka knew, and she knew a great many, such a transformation wasn't possible. Rekka couldn't do it at any rate, and could scarcely bear the thought that a less experienced mage had accomplished the feat. Yet that conclusion, as the spirit was again confounded by Rekka's wards, was inescapable. The banishing spell on Rekka's fingertips fizzled in the heat of curiosity. She had to learn the Gaius Ghost's secrets. Dissipating magic penetrated the spirit's awareness. It turned toward the door where Rekka stood, dead rabbits in one hand. Its face became an eloquent mask of fear, erasing any doubt that the spirit retained its living personality. A true miracle of magic. "Stay," Rekka commanded, but the word was without power, and the spirit vanished like snow ice in the wind. "Damn!" Rekka swore as she threw the rabbits across the room. The rabbits struck the pot, knocking it off the hearth irons, spilling hot water that raced towards the man sleeping within her wards. "Twice damn and thrice damn," Rekka continued, adding an incautious wish to have the last moment back. Heavy air filled the room. The water slowed and then reversed itself. Belatedly, Rekka realized that she was doing cold tea and crumpets. She shouted the curse to end other curses. The water flowed freely again, and in the proper order of time. She diverted it with a broom. There were eyes at Rekka's back. She came around to see her sleeping stranger sitting up within the wards, alert and healthy. Rekka sheathed a knife and grounded a spell. At the rate she was wasting magic, she was going to be up all night restoring her arsenal with her spellbooks. "Your name?" she demanded. She'd never been one for pleasantries. If he was awake, then it was time to start sharing whatever knowledge he had left inside his skull. "Your particulars, who and what you are, where were before I found you." "Eminthalor. Second." His voice stopped. He grew pale and swayed. "Eminthalor," he began again. "Second," and stopped in the same place and clapped his hands over his ears. "Rapport," Rekka reminded herself. Names were names and stayed the same despite rapport, but all the other words changed. Eminthalor was speaking a language he'd never learned and didn't believe he understood. "So, your name's Eminthalor." He lowered his hands and stared at them, every emotion known to man at play on his face. I was called Ermin long ago, I think." "If you were born in Netheril, Ermin, if you fell afoul of a wizard named Felsil, then it has been at least millennia since last you saw the sun." The swaying man worsened. Ermin clutched his knees to control it. His eyes darted, the signs of a man racing through his memories and finding them turned to dust. "Were you born in Netheril?" Rekka asked, as much to stop his frantic remembering as to have an answer. "Did you fall afoul of Felsil?" "Felsil?" Ermin asked, giving the name a subtly changed inflection. "Why tell you what you already know?" Rekka stifled her excitement. Ermin had mettle, the only quality she truly cherished in a man. More importantly, he remembered something of his former language. The spoken triggers of Netherese magic were hers for the gleaning. Full of nervous energy, she seized one of the rabbits and began skinning it with more vigour than skill. "Why, Ermin? Because I'm all you've got, and you've got an idea what I can do if you refuse." Ermin understood the message. "Yes, you could say I fell afoul of Felsil." Rekka threw offal in the fire and wiped her bloody hand on her leg. "Stole from him?" He took a moment to compose an answer. "He saw it that way." "With reason?" Another pause, longer than the first. Rekka looked up. Ermin's hands were clenched and he was staring at the fire. His voice, when he spoke, was a whisper. "Is freedom still counted as a crime?" "By some," Rekka conceded, expecting a challenge. Her wards still sparkled around him. Even if he couldn't see them, especially if he couldn't see them, he'd feel them like the bars of a cage. But Ermin surprised her. "I have given you my name. How shall I name you?" "Rekka." The half-skinned rabbit was slipperier than 10 eels bound together. The knife slipped and sliced off its front leg. Grateful that it hadn't been a finger, Rekka tossed the meat and bone into the fire. "Well, Hasruth, Rekka, if you'll trust me with that knife, I'll see that there's enough meat left for us both to eat." It was a sort of audacious remark she'd have made herself, were their positions reversed. Rekka set the mess between her knees. She admired audacity. She was beginning to admire this man. "And should I trust you with a knife?" she asked in a deceptively bantering tone. "No, but trust hardly matters, does it, Hasruth?" It surprised her again with a wry and bitter grin framing his words. Rekka swallowed a smile of her own and quenched her words. She stood up, leaving her knife and the meal behind on the floor. "Have at it, Ermin. I'm not a fussy eater." "Neither am I, Hasruth Rekka." Ermin's legs buckled as he stood, spoiling his carefree display. Rekka could have offered him a hand, but didn't. It wasn't her way. She didn't imagine that it was his. He caught his balance and took a tentative step. "Not any more, Hasruth." There was defeat and despair in his voice. Rekka realized with some surprise that she wanted more than words in a dead language from this man. She wanted another, less bitter grin for a start, but had no notion how to procure it, one ordinary human to another. "Hasruth," she asked as he made 2 quick, confident cuts with his knife. "Why call me that? What is Hasruth?" He finished skinning the rabbit, skewering it on the arrow she'd killed it with, and propped the laden arrow over the coals with his foot before answering. "Felsil was Hasruth." "Then I am simply Rekka, who stole a wooden box from Felsil's cave." Ermin tried to smile. Rekka saw the corners of his mouth twitch, but something she'd said rankled his memory. Maybe the box. She should have brought the pieces so he could burn his prison. Maybe something else. Whatever, Ermin sank into despair. She readied a spell that would freeze him where he sat, lest he do something foolish with the knife. His mood brightened to the aroma of roasting meat, but bleak despair was never more than a breath away. In her undersea bolt hole, Rekka had a grimoire filled with spells to keep a man smiling through any grief or torture. She considered retrieving it while Ermin slept. His energy flagged soon after they ate, but offered him her cloak before the hearth instead. "The embers will keep us warm," she said. "Us?" She tried to make a joke from his frown. A man and a woman together. You haven't forgotten, have you? No, but I have a bed. He pointed at the straw and dusty blankets. They'll be enough for me. Emin had surprised her again, and this time the surprise wasn't pleasant. I'd think you'd want company after 2 millennia alone in a box. Time. I need time to forget everything. A woman with gold hairpins. A dark-haired woman who hadn't forgotten him. I'm sorry, Rekka said softly, words that might well have been Netherese for all the times she'd used them. It hardly matters, does it? Ermin replied before he pulled the dusty blankets up around his ears. Rekka had a time-honoured way of dealing with anyone who shamed her. She found a reason to kill them before they spread the tale. Ermin, who fell asleep quickly and into the grip of muscle-wrenching nightmares, had no defence against her and, in the end, needed none. Rekka sat on the far side of the drafty, frigid room, wrapped in the cloak he wouldn't share. For the first time in a long time, her thoughts were focused not on sorcery, but on the even more arcane notion of affection. She'd reached no conclusions before the hearth coals winked out. Her cheeks were so cold she thought her eyes would freeze shut every time she blinked. She was warming her face against her knees when she sensed a change in the room. By the time she'd gotten her head up, the gayest ghost was kneeling beside Ermin again. There were no wards this time to repel its hands, but it was without the power to affect or experience the tangible world. At first, Rekka was fascinated, but fascination faded and the ghost's efforts became painful to watch. Desist, she suggested, not loudly enough to awaken Ermin, but laced with enough magic that the spirit would hear, and hearing would fade as it had faded before. When it had gone, Ermin cried out a single word. Sarah! A name. Rekka could command the gas ghost with its name, but she didn't, not that night. By the next day, she feared it was too late. Though Ermin ate and drank when she did, he drew no strength from his food. By noon, his skin matched the grey sky over winterwood. He was withering, dying. Rekka probed him with spellcraft, seeking a magical cause for his decline. She found only despair and denial. She probed him with questions, determined to learn all that she could of Netheril and its language before she lost him. She thought, too, as she interrogated him, that if he spoke of Sarah, it might relieve his pain. Did you have a family? Someone you left behind when you challenged Felsil? She asked. Challenged? Ermin retorted, the trace of metal Rekka admired returning to his eyes, but it faded. No one, he whispered, turning away, staring into the fire. I had already lost everything. Rekka was certain that he saw something in the flames, someone. His grief was so quiet, so private, that she who feared nothing dared not intrude, not even with a wish. His integrity had become so precious to her then, his happiness. She was at a loss, a place she'd never been. At sunset, she made tea with jasmine she'd bought from the sea cave. Drink this, she urged, moulding his limp fingers around the cup. You need to rebuild your strength. Ermin held the steaming cup, but didn't drink. For what? For more questions? Haven't I told you everything I know about the Hazruth? There is a world beyond Winterwood, a new world, without the Hazruth. I can show you. His face became a mask that locked Rekka out of his thoughts more effectively than all the wards of wizardry. What? She demanded, beginning to pace around the blankets where he sat. What do you want from me? What must I do to make you smile and laugh? I've given you back your life. What more do you want? I want what I had, Hazruth Rekka. You have the power. Give me death, the true death, and then I will smile. But you're alive. You're free. Be grateful for that.
Grateful that everything is gone? Grateful that I'm last and alone? You have me!
Ermin turned then and saw Rekka with her arm upraised in anger. She lowered it, but too late.
Hazrith. I am not Hazrith. Don't blame me for your failure. It's not my fault that she died. She?
Ermin asked softly. In the grip of rage, Rekka ignored the change in his tone.
Yes, she. Sarah, the dark-haired woman with the gold hairpins. Felsil's daughter, his lover? Did you seduce her? Did you think you could steal her away?
Ermin rose, unsteady, but without help. It was the bravery Rekka admired in him, but it wasn't enough to make her cautious.
You're a common, ordinary man, Ermin. You had no chance against magic, Sarah's or Felsil's.
He stood still, quiet. Rekka thought she'd gotten some sense into his head, and then he began to speak.
Common and ordinary, that's true enough. But I carried my lord's standards and covered his back in battle. I had honour. When we went to him, he held our hands between his and gave us his blessing, me, his first man, and Jan Serahel, his last daughter. We had honour and more. We had love. But we had no chance, not against the Hazrith.
Rekka learned as Ermin spat out the last word Hazrith, how Jan Sarer might have managed to fuel her Gaia's spell with her own life's essence. Rekka's rage was extravagant, backed by centuries of sorcery and experience. It was powerful, but scarcely focused. Ermin's passion, common and ordinary, was so tightly constrained. Had he been any sort of mage, he'd have become a living fireball or a lightning bolt. He, thank Mistra, had no talent, but Jan Serelhal did. It was a useful lesson, and one she'd put to good use in the future, but for now,
I am not Hazrith. You know her name. We died together. Hazrith Felsil had come, unannounced, as was his way. He called the household together in Netheril. To have magic was to belong to the Hazrith, and they were always looking. Everyone was examined, always, from my lord to the least. It was unpleasant, because they enjoyed it, but I had no fear. I've been through it many times before, and Sarah too. We were Netherin. It was our lives. Then the miserable bastard called her. Nay, Sorel, you will come. She had no talent, but that didn't matter. The Hazrith wanted her. She screamed and ran toward me. My lord could do nothing, not against the Hazrith. We knew, all of us, what would happen if we tried. But for Sarah and I, the worst had happened. Ermin paused, ironic even in anger. Or so we thought. I caught her before he did. I remember fire as I held her in my arms. We died together. You brought me back. You know her name. Where is she, Hazrith Rekka? What have you done with her, Hazrith?
Rekka opened her mouth.
I've done nothing.
But the denial could not squeeze past the memory of the Gaius ghost fading.
I'm not Hazrith.
A statement of faith, not fact, spoken as Rekka ran from the lodge. Ermin's words following her.
Hazrith! Hazrith! You have magic for your heart!
3 trees and 1 bear-sized rock suffered Rekka's wrath before she curbed it. The witherwood swirled, sharp ice in her face. Too much magic, too little cause. Hazrith. I'm not! Her voice was lost in the wind. Rekka could challenge the storm, win a battle and lose the war within, if she had not already lost it. She was human, born mortal, but she'd never grown old, because she'd tripped through a time weave. That's what she'd thought. Or was Ermin right? Rekka began to shiver, cold and shame combined. She'd left her cloak behind, and though she could warm herself with a spell, magic wasn't the answer. She hunkered behind a fir tree and told herself she wasn't Hazrith, that she had a heart
until she knew, by the emptiness within, that she lied. "I'm leaving. I'm going home," she announced to anyone in earshot, but the sea cave with its trove of heartless magic was not the place she wanted. If not there, then where? The lodge? For Ermin? With Ermin? Rekka summoned his memory. She was lonely, but lonely was different than alone. She wouldn't give up magic for anyone's company. For Yin Serau? She did feel guilty, and guilt was a terrible thing in the emptiness of her heart, but guilt always festered, with or without magic to fuel it. She wouldn't go anywhere for guilt. For herself, because she'd become accustomed to being alone and had never guessed anything was wrong or missing, because the only magic left was the magic of the mortal's heart she'd abandoned, and the only way to find it was through Ermin and his beloved. She called the gas ghost. Not surprisingly, she didn't come. The pale sun had fallen below the treetops, and the moon was already bright in a cloudless sky. Rekka's sleeves and breeches crackled where she stood. Clear nights were the coldest nights, not nights for being alone. She retraced her steps. There were other tracks crossing hers at the threshold, leading away from the lodge. "Damned fool!" she muttered and opened the door with a mighty crash. "I wouldn't let either of you get away." Ermin had taken her staff, which was useless to him except as a crutch, and left her cloak, which might have kept him alive. Rekka furled the heavy pelt around her shoulders and set off at a run. He hadn't gone far, just to a wind-scoured rock where he sat, staring at the moon. His eyes were closed and ice-glazed, but there was a pulse in his wrists, a moan through his lips when he looked at her. "Let me go. We died together. We'll be together. Fool! No matter who or what you worship, death's not like that. And anyway, she's not exactly dead." "She?" Ermin was stupid with cold. "Sarah. Nasera. Who else? Neither of you died. You were put in a box, and she..." Rekka despaired of an explanation he would accept without despising her more than he already did. "It's all magic, Ermin. You don't care about magic, do you? You talk in your sleep, Ermin. That's how I knew her name. But your Sarah had the knack for magic. She survived. She found out about Felsil's box. She made sure she would be waiting when her Geas freed you." Ermin began to shiver. He was fighting the cold, fighting death. Rekka wrapped in her cloak and left her arms resting on his shoulders. "Where?" "That's the problem. You can't see her. You can't touch her. And me, well, Ermin, you're going to have to trust that I have a heart. I've made mistakes, but I'm not Felsil. Damn, it's cold. Let's get back to the lodge." "No! Sarah's here." Ermin glanced left and right. "Let me see her." "It's not that easy. Let me see her." He struggled against the weight of her arms. Stiff as he was, Rekka feared she'd hurt him if they wrestled. "I don't know what's going to get us warm again once this is over, but call her." She waited as Ermin warred with his conscience before whispering, "Sarah, with your heart." Ermin sighed, and a moment later, Sarah's familiar shape flickered in the shadows, well beyond Rekka's reach. With one hand on Ermin's shoulder, Rekka beckoned the Geas ghost closer. Wide-eyed and stubborn, she stayed where she was. "Take my hand," Rekka commanded. "She's here? Where?" "Tell her you trust me. It's a lie. Then make it the truth, or give it up. This cold will kill." He closed his eyes and succumbed to shivering. "Trust me, Ermin. I'm not Hazrith." Sarah came closer, hesitated, extended a translucent hand. Rekka felt nothing until hard-won reflexes cut in, fighting the spell, protecting the magic-obsessed person Rekka wished to leave behind. For a moment, it seemed that reflex would triumph, But then someone, possibly Reka herself, said, "Trust me." And Sarah flowed into her, cold as the winter twilight. Reka retreated into herself, behind wardings meant to protect her memory from a Tanari's assault. Her appearance had begun to shift. Her will, her magic, her gift that Ermin actually see the love he'd lost. "Sarah," his voice was awed. An arm that was still Reka's own moved towards Ermin's face. It would have been easy to burst her self-appointed prison, to destroy Jan Serahal, while keeping her shape and a few of her memories. But Reka didn't know what to do with those soft, delicate fingers, where to touch Ermin's cheek to make him smile. Her cold voice said, "Ermin," and a torrent of other words she didn't understand. The transformation was nearly complete. Another heartbeat, no more than 2 or 3. Will she? Or nil she? Reka would be possessed for how long? The question came late. Reka had surrendered everything except a shred of awareness that lips were pressed together, touching and being touched. Would it be enough? Would it last? Then the warmth of the summer was within her, swaying in a gentle breeze, bursting with laughter. Reka had her answer. Forever wouldn't be long enough. Spare a few coins for our old sage's dry throat, if you please. My thanks. I'll have more for you very soon.